At first,
Cops?
no
What's
one
going on?
reacted.
I don't know.
The sound
Just keep
seemed
grilling.
distant,
What is
detached
this
from the
distance
lazy
against the
Saturday
brick wall?
afternoon that had settled comfortably over our subdivision. The sun hung low and warm, casting a golden sheen across identical rooftops and freshly edged lawns that looked like they'd been measured with rulers. My grill sizzled steadily in the backyard, thin ribbons of smoke drifting upward in calm spirals. Children's laughter bounced off vinyl fences. Ice clinked in plastic cups. It was the kind of peaceful suburban scene real estate agents love to advertise. Then the siren grew louder. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. A football stopped rolling across the
Order!
grass.
Everyone, please!
I turned
Mr.
slowly
President, the
toward
evidence
side
is
gate
irrefutable.
just as flashing red and blue
This
lights
is out of
reflected
order.
against the stainless steel lid of my grill. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of my house. The shift in atmosphere was instant. Neighbors who had been gardening straightened and stared. Curtains twitched along the row of uniform beige homes. My guests exchanged confused glances, their relaxed expressions replaced with cautious uncertainty. The children froze as if someone had pressed pause on the afternoon. The smell of barbecue no longer felt inviting. It felt incriminating. An officer stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt as he approached my driveway. Another remained by the vehicle, scanning the property with detached professionalism. I felt a pulse of heat rise in my chest, though the grill flames remained steady and contained. It didn't take long to guess who had made the call. From her elevated wooden deck next door, partially shielded by perfectly trimmed hedges, the HOA president stood with her arms folded. She wasn't hiding. She never hid. She observed. Always composed. Always certain. The posture of someone who believed she was safeguarding something sacred. The neighborhood. The standards. The order. The officers informed me that a complaint had been filed regarding excessive smoke, a potential fire hazard, and disruptive noise levels. According to the report, the gathering in my backyard posed a threat to community safety. I glanced at the small Bluetooth speaker resting on a patio table, barely audible beyond the fence line. I looked at the grill, clean, approved propane model listed specifically as acceptable under HOA regulations. I had read the handbook carefully before lighting it. I knew the quiet hours. I knew the distance requirements. I knew the rules because in this neighborhood, survival required knowing them better than the people who enforced them. Still, the sight of patrol cars in front of my home did damage no rulebook could measure. The officers conducted a brief inspection. They walked the perimeter, checked the grill, assessed the yard. Their expressions shifted from alert to mildly irritated. There was no violation. No hazard. No disturbance beyond the ordinary sounds of a weekend. They left within minutes. But the mark had already been made. When the cruisers pulled away, silence lingered in their wake. My guests tried to resume conversation, but the rhythm was broken. Laughter returned in smaller, hesitant bursts. The children played again, though more cautiously, glancing toward the street every few minutes. Across the fence, she remained on her deck. Watching. This wasn't the first time she had exercised her authority. Since moving into the community 18 months earlier, I had received 3 written notices, one about trash bins being visible for an extra hour past pickup time, another about grass height exceeding regulation by half an inch, and a warning regarding a temporary basketball hoop in the driveway. Each infraction had been minor. Each citation delivered with clinical precision. No room for interpretation. No benefit of the doubt. But calling the police felt different. This wasn't enforcement. It was escalation. As the afternoon faded into evening, guests slowly filtered out, offering polite reassurances that it wasn't a big deal. Their smiles carried sympathy, but also relief that the spectacle hadn't involved their own homes. Once the gate closed behind the last car, the quiet of the neighborhood returned, manufactured and orderly. I extinguished the grill and stood alone in the yard, staring at the thin smoke dissolving into the darkening sky. The air still carried the scent of charred wood and spice, but now it mingled with something else. Embarrassment. Anger. Curiosity. Because something about the incident felt intentional beyond simple irritation over barbecue smoke. The call had been calculated. Precise. Designed not only to interrupt my afternoon, but to send a message to the rest of the street. Compliance is expected. Authority will be enforced. And resistance will be visible. As dusk settled, porch lights flicked on in perfect symmetry down the block. Lawns glowed under evenly spaced landscape lighting, maintenance crews funded by our monthly HOA dues. The same dues that seemed to increase every year without clear explanation. The HOA president's house stood slightly brighter than the rest, recently upgraded patio stones gleaming under soft illumination. New shrubs lined her walkway, fuller and healthier than those around neighboring properties. Small enhancements that had appeared gradually over the past year. I had noticed them before. But tonight, standing in the cooling backyard where patrol cars had just idled, I noticed them differently. The barbecue had been harmless. The rules had been followed. Yet escalation had come swiftly and publicly. People don't escalate without motive. I walked inside and pulled the HOA handbook from a kitchen drawer. The thick packet of bylaws, regulations, and amendments felt heavier than paper should. I flipped through pages outlining architectural guidelines, noise restrictions, landscaping standards, and enforcement procedures. Everything was meticulous, structured, controlled. And somewhere within those pages was the foundation that allowed one person to weaponize procedure against another. If she was willing to involve law enforcement over smoke that disappeared within minutes, what else was she willing to do? The thought lingered long after the dishes were washed and the house grew quiet. Through the bedroom window, I could see her deck light still glowing next door. A silhouette moved briefly across the curtain before disappearing. She believed she had reinforced her authority. But something else had happened that afternoon. She had shifted my role from compliant homeowner to interested observer. And once observation begins, patterns reveal themselves. The barbecue had ended. But the fire had just started. In neighborhoods like ours, conflict rarely begins with something dramatic. It begins quietly, disguised as policy, courtesy, or community standards. By the time it becomes visible, the roots have already wrapped themselves tightly beneath the surface. The subdivision had been marketed as a premium lifestyle enclave, complete with tree-lined streets, uniform mailboxes, and a homeowners association designed to protect long-term property values. When I first moved in, the structure felt reassuring. Predictability has its appeal. Rules promise fairness. Oversight suggests stability. But structure, in the wrong hands, becomes leverage. The HOA president had lived in the community for nearly a decade. She was there when the first houses were built, when the first trees were planted, when the initial bylaws were drafted. Her name appeared repeatedly in archived newsletters, often credited with maintaining neighborhood excellence and championing compliance initiatives. At first glance, her involvement seemed admirable. She attended every meeting. She responded to emails promptly. She walked the streets regularly, clipboard in hand, making notes. But over time, patterns began to emerge. Certain homes received more citations than others. Certain neighbors were inspected more frequently. Minor infractions in some yards went unnoticed, while others were documented meticulously. The enforcement felt selective, never openly hostile, but quietly targeted. I had experienced the pattern myself long before the barbecue incident. The first notice arrived 2 months after I moved in. My trash bins had remained at the curb slightly longer than permitted after collection day. The fine was small, but the wording of the letter carried disproportionate weight. It referenced community pride and collective responsibility, as if a plastic bin had personally insulted the integrity of the entire subdivision. The second citation followed shortly after. My lawn measured a fraction of an inch above regulation height. A photograph was attached as evidence. The image had been taken early in the morning, likely during one of her routine patrols. Each notice felt less like a correction and more like a reminder, someone was watching. Meanwhile, her own property seemed immune from scrutiny. Renovations appeared without public discussion. New patio stones replaced old ones. Landscaping crews spent hours refining her flower beds while other sections of the neighborhood remained untouched for weeks. The disparity was subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion. But repetition has a way of sharpening perception. Behind the facade of order, financial tension simmered. HOA dues had increased steadily for 3 consecutive years. The justification was always the same: rising maintenance costs, unexpected repairs, inflation. Yet visible improvements across the neighborhood remained minimal. The clubhouse, though serviceable, showed no significant upgrades. Community events grew less frequent. The playground equipment aged without replacement. Still, the Community Enhancement Fund, listed in each annual report, continued to expand. Most homeowners didn't question it. Busy schedules and the comfort of routine discouraged scrutiny. People prefer to believe that institutions function as advertised. Challenging them requires time, energy, and the willingness to be labeled difficult. I had avoided that label for as long as possible. Life outside the HOA consumed enough attention. Work deadlines. Mortgage payments. Family obligations. The last thing I wanted was unnecessary friction with someone who held administrative authority over my home. But the police at my barbecue shifted something deeper. It wasn't merely embarrassing, it revealed an imbalance of power. If one individual could escalate a minor irritation into an official complaint involving law enforcement, what stopped her from escalating other matters? What mechanisms allowed her to act so confidently? The answer lay in structure. The HOA board technically consisted of 5 members. In practice, only 3 attended meetings consistently. Of those 3, 2 rarely spoke unless prompted. Decisions passed quickly, often unanimously, without visible debate. Leadership thrives in silence. After the barbecue incident, I began observing more closely. Landscaping trucks arrived at irregular intervals, often spending disproportionate time near the president's property. Seasonal decorations funded by the HOA appeared minimal, 1 banner at the entrance, a few wreaths in winter, despite sizable allocations listed in financial summaries. The Community Enhancement Fund line item grew more curious with each quarterly report. It absorbed a significant percentage of dues but lacked detailed breakdowns. The descriptions remained vague: beautification projects, infrastructure updates, community improvements. Improvements where? Infrastructure for what? When I casually asked a neighbor if they had noticed any major upgrades recently, they shrugged. Most couldn't recall specifics. Some assumed funds were being saved for future projects. Others admitted they rarely reviewed the financial summaries at all. Apathy is fertile ground for misuse. Beneath the polished surface of manicured lawns and synchronized porch lights, the HOA operated like a small government with limited oversight. Authority concentrated at the top. Participation dwindled below. And then there was pride. The HOA president didn't merely enforce rules, she embodied them. Her identity seemed intertwined with control. Any perceived challenge, no matter how small, was addressed swiftly. My barbecue had not violated regulations, but it had introduced unpredictability. Guests gathered. Smoke rose visibly. Attention shifted. In tightly controlled systems, unpredictability is uncomfortable. The police call had been less about smoke and more about reasserting order. But reassertion carries risk. Overreach exposes cracks. As I revisited the financial summaries, one realization crystallized: the tension in our neighborhood wasn't only about grass height or trash bins. It was about transparency versus authority. About whether governance served residents or shielded itself. My frustration no longer centered on embarrassment. It centered on imbalance. Because if the structure truly functioned as intended, scrutiny would not be threatening. And if scrutiny was threatening, something underneath required protection. I began compiling past newsletters, archived emails, and previous financial statements. Patterns in numbers can reveal more than arguments ever could. Increases without corresponding improvements. Vendor names appearing repeatedly without clear project descriptions. The deeper I looked, the more the barbecue felt like a trigger rather than an isolated event. Perhaps she had believed the police visit would discourage further resistance. Instead, it sharpened my focus. Beneath the calm facade of our premium lifestyle enclave, tensions had been accumulating quietly for years. Rising dues. Uneven enforcement. Limited transparency. Passive board members. Selective improvements. The neighborhood appeared stable. But stability built on unchecked authority is fragile. And for the first time since moving in, I felt less like a resident under observation and more like an observer of the system itself. The struggle was no longer personal. It was structural. And structures, once examined closely enough, either prove their integrity or reveal the hollow spaces within. In tightly managed neighborhoods, tension doesn't erupt overnight. It travels quietly from yard to yard, carried in glances, half-finished sentences, and the subtle tightening of posture whenever a certain name is mentioned. After the police cars left my curb, something intangible began connecting me to others on the block. Before that afternoon, I had been just another homeowner navigating minor citations. Afterward, I became the example. People didn't approach me immediately. Suburban culture discourages overt alliances. Instead, they offered small acknowledgments. A longer than usual wave while collecting mail. A sympathetic nod during evening walks. Casual remarks about how things have been getting stricter lately. These were not complaints. They were invitations. One evening, while trimming the hedge along my fence line, carefully measuring the regulation height, I noticed my neighbor across the street lingering near his driveway. He had lived there longer than I had. Quiet, steady, rarely involved in meetings. After a few minutes of mutual avoidance, he crossed the street. His tone was neutral, but his eyes carried something heavier. He mentioned receiving a warning for leaving patio chairs stacked too visibly during winter. Another neighbor had been fined for repainting her front door a shade that deviated slightly from the approved palette. Someone else had been cited twice in 1 month for parking alignment. Each story alone sounded trivial. Together, they formed a pattern. The emotional weight wasn't in the fines themselves. Most were small enough to pay without hardship. The weight came from the feeling of being constantly monitored, corrected, and subtly shamed. The letters arrived with formal language that suggested negligence rather than minor oversight. The tone was never openly hostile, but it carried superiority. Over time, that tone erodes morale. I began to understand that my barbecue had simply been more visible. Public. Dramatic. It forced an escalation that others had quietly avoided by adjusting behavior. Many residents had learned to self-regulate beyond the rules, trimming hedges shorter than required, storing decorations sooner than necessary, limiting gatherings to avoid attention. Compliance had become psychological. At the next casual encounter near the mailbox cluster, another homeowner shared her concern about rising dues. She had reviewed the latest financial summary and noticed the steady growth of the Community Enhancement Fund. Yet her requests for clarification had been met with polite deflection. Her frustration mirrored my own, but she hesitated to push further. No one wanted to become the next target. This was the emotional bridge forming between us, not anger, but shared unease. I felt it most strongly during evening walks. The neighborhood looked immaculate under sunset light. Sprinklers rotated with synchronized precision. Lawns appeared trimmed to uniform perfection. Yet beneath that symmetry was tension, an unspoken understanding that deviation invited attention. Authority in such environments thrives on isolation. Each homeowner believes their irritation is personal, individual, insignificant. The moment connections form, isolation weakens. I started attending more HOA meetings, not to confront, but to observe reactions. I watched faces when financial updates were presented. Subtle shifts occurred, raised eyebrows, exchanged glances, quiet whispers after adjournment. Questions were asked cautiously, framed as curiosity rather than challenge. The HOA president maintained composure. Her posture remained upright, her language measured. But beneath the surface, I sensed strain. Increased scrutiny unsettles even the most confident leadership. As I continued examining the financial documents, my motivation evolved. Initially, it had been about justice for the barbecue incident. Now, it felt larger. The emotional bridge connecting neighbors created responsibility. If irregularities existed, exposing them would not only vindicate me, it would restore equilibrium. I noticed something else during this period. The president's behavior intensified. Patrols through the neighborhood became more frequent. Notices were delivered more promptly. Reminders about compliance appeared in newsletters with sharper wording. It was as if she sensed shifting currents and responded by tightening control. Fear often masquerades as firmness. One afternoon, as I reviewed printed invoices at my kitchen table, I considered the personal risk involved in pursuing this further. Challenging institutional authority, even at a neighborhood level, invites scrutiny. My own records would likely be examined more closely. Minor oversights could be amplified. The safe choice would have been withdrawal. Host smaller gatherings. Keep the lawn impeccable. Pay any minor fines without question. Blend into the uniformity. But the emotional bridge I felt with neighbors altered that calculation. Their quiet frustrations echoed my own. The pattern of selective enforcement and opaque finances extended beyond a single barbecue. It became clear that what we were experiencing wasn't simply strict governance, it was imbalance. And imbalance breeds resentment. Late one evening, I walked past the clubhouse. Its lights were off, but the landscape beds near the entrance looked recently refreshed. Fresh mulch. Newly planted shrubs. Small improvements that aligned neatly with expense reports labeled beautification. Yet other areas of the neighborhood showed no similar attention. Sidewalk cracks remained unrepaired. Playground paint chipped quietly under neglect. The disparity felt symbolic. Resources flowed toward visibility rather than necessity. As I stood there, the weight of responsibility settled in. Exposing financial irregularities would not be simple. It would require evidence beyond suspicion. Documentation beyond patterns. Facts strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Emotion alone would not suffice. But emotion had built the bridge. Without it, I might have accepted the police visit as an isolated humiliation. I might have moved on. Instead, the shared undercurrent of unease transformed personal grievance into collective concern. Over the next several days, I organized documents methodically. I mapped vendor addresses. I cross-referenced business registrations. I highlighted inconsistencies. The work was tedious, almost clinical. Yet beneath the spreadsheets and photocopies pulsed something human, the desire for fairness. Not revenge. Balance. The emotional bridge between neighbors grew stronger as small conversations continued. No formal alliance formed, but awareness spread. Attendance at the next HOA meeting increased noticeably. Chairs filled more quickly. The room felt heavier, expectant. Control depends on predictability. And predictability was fading. As I prepared my binder of documentation, I understood that what began with smoke from a grill had ignited something more enduring. Not chaos, but consciousness. The barbecue had drawn attention to one yard. Now, attention was widening. And once a community begins to look at itself honestly, it cannot easily return to ignorance. By the time the next HOA meeting arrived, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted from quiet unease to contained anticipation. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No one organized petitions or posted signs. But driveways emptied earlier than usual that evening, and more residents than I had ever seen walked toward the clubhouse at the same time. Attendance itself can be a statement. The room filled quickly. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people settled in. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile brightness over carefully arranged tables at the front. The HOA president sat in her usual position, flanked by two board members who appeared slightly more rigid than before. A neat stack of folders rested in front of her, arranged with deliberate precision. She looked prepared. But so was I. The agenda followed its typical structure at first: landscaping updates, compliance reminders, minor architectural requests. The routine felt almost rehearsed, as though familiarity might soothe the subtle tension building beneath it. Then came the financial report. A single-page summary was distributed, just as it had been in prior meetings. Total dues collected. Maintenance expenses. Insurance. Utilities. And again, the line item labeled Community Enhancement Fund. The number had grown. There was a pause before anyone spoke. The room felt heavier than usual. Pages rustled as residents scanned the sheet more carefully this time. I raised my hand. The gesture seemed small, but it altered the room immediately. Heads turned. The president acknowledged the motion with a controlled nod. I stood slowly, binder in hand. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size. Inside were printed invoices, business registration documents, permit searches, expense comparisons, and annotated financial statements. Weeks of quiet investigation compressed into organized evidence. There was no anger in the room, only focus. I began by referencing the bylaws that guaranteed homeowners the right to review financial records in detail. I noted the discrepancies between reported expenses and visible improvements. I pointed out vendor names that appeared repeatedly without clear project descriptions. I referenced business addresses linked to residential properties. I highlighted payments issued without corresponding permits for listed upgrades. Each point was delivered methodically. The room grew still. Board members shifted in their seats. The president's expression remained composed, but her posture tightened almost imperceptibly. She attempted to respond by framing the discrepancies as administrative complexities, delays in documentation, clerical errors, evolving vendor contracts. But the binder contained more than surface-level inconsistencies. It contained patterns. Photographs of the clubhouse landscaping before and after supposed major enhancements. Comparisons of invoiced amounts to market-standard costs. Registration records linking vendors to individuals with personal connections to board members. Murmurs began to ripple across the room. The shift was no longer subtle. For the first time, attention was directed squarely at the front table, not in passive acceptance, but in evaluation. Neighbors leaned forward instead of leaning back. Some began flipping through their own copies of the financial summary more critically. The president attempted to regain control by suggesting that concerns be addressed privately after the meeting. The proposal was calm, procedural, and framed as efficient governance. But the room resisted. A motion was proposed, this time from another homeowner, to initiate an independent audit of HOA finances. The suggestion hung in the air like a test of collective courage. Silence stretched. Then a second homeowner voiced support. Then a third. The board members exchanged glances that no longer felt coordinated. Authority relies heavily on unity at the top. Visible hesitation fractures perception. The president's tone sharpened slightly as she warned of unnecessary expenses and potential disruption. She emphasized trust, experience, and the years she had dedicated to preserving property values. But trust, once questioned publicly, does not repair itself through repetition. A vote was called. Hands rose throughout the room, more than I had anticipated. The majority was undeniable. The motion passed. The shift in power was not explosive. It did not involve shouting or confrontation. It manifested as something quieter but more profound: collective decision. Control had moved from a single voice to many. The president closed the meeting with visible restraint. Her usual confident cadence felt thinner. The gavel struck the table with slightly more force than necessary. As residents filtered out into the parking lot, conversations erupted in hushed clusters. There was no celebration, only a shared sense of crossing an invisible line. The act of public challenge had altered the dynamic permanently. For years, the structure had operated without meaningful scrutiny. Now scrutiny was formalized. Walking back toward my house, I noticed porch lights flickering on across the block. The neighborhood looked unchanged at first glance: lawns trimmed, mailboxes aligned, symmetry intact. But perception had shifted. Earlier that spring, police lights had flashed in front of my driveway, isolating me in quiet embarrassment. Now, under the glow of street lamps, I felt the opposite of isolation. The emotional bridge built over weeks of small conversations had solidified into collective action. Yet rising tension does not resolve instantly. The following days brought subtle retaliation. Inspection notices increased in frequency. Emails from the HOA office carried sharper language. Reminders about compliance filled inboxes with unusual urgency. The president was not relinquishing authority easily. But something crucial had changed. Scrutiny now flowed both directions. When landscaping crews arrived the following week, several homeowners observed their work closely. When new invoices were circulated, they were read carefully rather than skimmed. Attendance at the subsequent board planning session doubled. Rising tension often reveals character. The president appeared more guarded, more defensive. Her once effortless composure required visible effort. Authority built on unquestioned acceptance now faced examination. As for me, the weight of responsibility deepened. Public challenge carries consequences beyond exposure. If the audit revealed nothing significant, I would become the instigator who stirred unnecessary conflict. If it revealed substantial misconduct, the fallout would reshape the community entirely. Either outcome carried gravity. But the decision to challenge publicly had already been made. The barbecue that began this chain of events felt distant now, almost trivial compared to the broader implications unfolding. What had once been about smoke and humiliation had evolved into governance and accountability. The neighborhood stood at a quiet crossroads. And once transparency is demanded in public, there is no easy path back to comfortable silence. The audit began without spectacle. No dramatic announcements. No public confrontations. Just a quiet engagement letter circulated to homeowners confirming that an independent accounting firm would review 3 years of HOA financial records. The process was described as routine, precautionary, and necessary to ensure continued fiscal integrity. The language sounded harmless. But beneath it, tension thickened. Over the next several weeks, the neighborhood seemed to operate in suspended animation. Landscaping continued. Mail was delivered. Lawns were trimmed to regulation height. Yet conversations carried an undercurrent of anticipation. Every passing truck near the clubhouse drew curious glances. Every email from the board was opened more quickly than usual. The president maintained outward composure. She sent carefully worded updates describing cooperation with auditors and reaffirming her commitment to transparency. But subtle changes in behavior suggested strain. Her patrols through the neighborhood became less frequent. Board members who once projected unity now appeared independently rather than in coordinated clusters. Authority was no longer effortless. Inside the clubhouse office, boxes of financial records were handed over: ledgers, invoices, bank statements, contracts, reimbursement forms. Years of documentation, once shielded behind locked cabinets, now sat under neutral scrutiny. The process was methodical and slow. For the first 2 weeks, no information surfaced. Silence settled heavily over the community. Some homeowners began to speculate that the concerns might dissolve into clerical corrections. Others feared retaliation if the audit concluded without findings. I wrestled privately with uncertainty. Had I misinterpreted patterns? Had frustration over the barbecue sharpened my suspicions beyond reason? Public challenge leaves little room for retreat. If nothing emerged, I would be remembered as the one who disrupted stability. But patterns rarely form without cause. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening. An email notification appeared with the subject line, "Preliminary Audit Findings." It was addressed to all homeowners. The message was brief but weighty. The independent firm had identified irregularities requiring immediate review by legal counsel. A summary of findings would be presented at an emergency meeting scheduled for the following week. The tone was restrained, but unmistakable. Irregularities. The word spread quickly. Neighbors stepped outside under the pretense of watering plants or checking mail, phones in hand. Small clusters formed at sidewalk edges. No one spoke loudly, yet the air carried electric anticipation. At the emergency meeting, attendance exceeded capacity. Chairs ran out. Residents stood along the walls. The atmosphere felt different from prior gatherings, not tense in the same way, but focused with a shared understanding that something definitive was about to surface. Representatives from the accounting firm stood at the front beside the remaining board members. The president sat at the table, posture straight but noticeably subdued. The presentation unfolded with clinical precision. Over a 3-year period, funds allocated to the Community Enhancement Fund had been redirected through a network of vendors with direct personal connections to a board member. Invoices were consistently inflated beyond market rates. Certain projects billed as neighborhood-wide beautification were performed exclusively near specific properties. More strikingly, several payments categorized as emergency maintenance had no corresponding physical repairs. Bank transfers revealed reimbursements issued without formal board approval. The total misallocated amount surpassed expectations. Tens of thousands of dollars. A collective stillness filled the room. No gasps. No immediate outbursts. Just the heavy realization settling across faces that had once trusted without question. The unexpected revelation wasn't simply that funds had been mishandled, it was the sophistication of the pattern. The transactions had been spaced strategically to avoid detection. Amounts were kept just below thresholds that might trigger automatic review. Documentation appeared legitimate at surface level, supported by invoices bearing company logos and service descriptions. But deeper examination revealed that some of those companies were recently formed entities registered to relatives of the HOA president. Others were shell operations with minimal public presence. The most sobering detail came near the end of the presentation. Personal reimbursements categorized as administrative stipends had been issued monthly without disclosure to homeowners. The bylaws permitted limited compensation under specific conditions, but no formal vote authorizing such payments had occurred. The president's face remained composed, though the controlled stillness now resembled containment rather than confidence. The revelation shifted something fundamental in the room. The narrative that had once framed strict enforcement as devotion to property values now appeared distorted. The very individual who had cited homeowners over minor aesthetic infractions had overseen financial conduct far more consequential. The irony did not go unnoticed. As the auditors concluded, legal counsel outlined next steps: a full forensic audit, potential restitution, referral to authorities if warranted, and immediate suspension of any board member implicated in irregularities. The president's authority evaporated in that moment, not through shouting or humiliation, but through documented evidence. After the meeting adjourned, the parking lot felt transformed. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now spoke openly. Some expressed anger. Others expressed disbelief. A few appeared quietly vindicated. For me, the revelation carried complex emotion. There was validation, certainly. The patterns I had traced were not imagined. The barbecue had not been an overreaction to trivial irritation. It had been a glimpse into a broader misuse of power. But there was also disappointment. Communities depend on trust. Even flawed leadership is preferable to corruption disguised as stewardship. The realization that dues paid by retirees, young families, and working professionals had been diverted for personal benefit cast a shadow heavier than any police visit ever had. Walking home under streetlights that night, I passed the clubhouse. Its exterior looked unchanged: brick facade, neatly trimmed hedges, polished sign bearing the neighborhood's name. Structures rarely reflect internal decay. The unexpected revelation had not arrived with spectacle. It came through spreadsheets, signatures, and transaction records. Through quiet numbers that told a louder story than any accusation could. The barbecue smoke that once drifted harmlessly into the sky now felt symbolic. What had been framed as disruption had ultimately illuminated something concealed. And concealment, once exposed, cannot return to secrecy. The neighborhood stood on the edge of consequence. The audit had revealed the breach. What followed would determine whether accountability restored trust, or fractured it beyond repair. The weeks following the emergency meeting unfolded with a gravity that felt heavier than the original revelation. When misconduct is exposed publicly, the aftermath rarely explodes. It settles. Slowly. Like dust after a structure collapses. The HOA board moved quickly under legal guidance. The president was formally suspended pending further investigation. Access to financial accounts was frozen. Remaining board members, visibly shaken, issued a statement acknowledging oversight failures and pledging full cooperation with authorities. 4 years, enforcement letters had arrived in crisp envelopes, confident and unyielding. Now, official correspondence carried humility. The full forensic audit confirmed the preliminary findings. Funds had been funneled through related party vendors. Beautification projects had disproportionately benefited one section of the neighborhood. Administrative stipends had been issued without transparent authorization. Invoices had been structured deliberately to avoid attention. The total misappropriated amount was significant enough to warrant legal action. Local authorities became involved, not dramatically, not with sirens, but through paperwork, interviews, and formal inquiries. The same police department that once responded to a complaint about barbecue smoke now reviewed financial statements tied to the HOA's leadership. There was a quiet symmetry in that. The president's resignation came shortly afterward. It was delivered in writing, framed as a decision to step aside for the good of the community. The language attempted dignity, but the departure felt inevitable. Her house went on the market within a month. The once immaculate deck where she had stood observing my backyard gathering sat empty. Landscaping crews trimmed hedges there for the final time before a real estate sign replaced authority with vacancy. But resolution was more than removal. The board was restructured through a special election. For the first time in years, multiple candidates ran with platforms centered on transparency and accountability. Meetings were live-streamed. Financial statements were expanded from single-page summaries to detailed multi-page reports accessible online. Vendor contracts required competitive bids and documented approval. The Community Enhancement Fund was redefined with strict limitations and quarterly disclosures. A portion of recovered funds, secured through restitution agreements, was credited back to homeowners. Change did not arrive perfectly or instantly. There were disagreements about future projects, debates over dues adjustments, and growing pains as new leadership found its footing. But the tone had shifted. Governance felt participatory rather than imposed. The emotional bridges formed during tension matured into engagement. Neighbors who once avoided meetings began attending regularly. Questions were asked without hesitation. Answers were expected without defensiveness. The culture of quiet compliance had been replaced by conscious involvement. For me, the resolution carried a quieter, more personal impact. I hosted another barbecue the following spring. The day was nearly identical to the one that had ignited everything. Sunlight poured across uniform rooftops. Children ran across trimmed lawns. Smoke rose steadily from the grill. But this time, the smoke felt lighter. No patrol cars appeared. No curtains twitched suspiciously. Neighbors arrived without caution, bringing dishes and folding chairs. Laughter returned fully, unfiltered by fear of scrutiny. As I stood by the grill, watching the smoke curl into open sky, I realized the true shift had not been financial, it had been psychological. Power thrives in opacity. Once light enters, its shape changes. The moral impact of what had happened extended beyond one president's misconduct. It served as a reminder that systems, no matter how small, require oversight. That authority unexamined can drift toward self-interest. That silence, while comfortable, allows imbalance to root itself quietly. The police call that once felt humiliating now felt catalytic. If that afternoon had passed without escalation, I might never have examined the financial reports closely. Neighbors might have continued absorbing incremental dues increases without question. Enforcement letters might have grown stricter while financial transparency grew weaker. Instead, one disproportionate action exposed a larger distortion. The community learned that accountability is not confrontation, it is participation. It does not require hostility, it requires attention. And attention, once shared collectively, becomes powerful. Months later, the new HOA board hosted a town hall-style gathering focused on rebuilding trust. Financial charts were projected clearly. Budgets were debated openly. Residents volunteered for committees overseeing landscaping, maintenance, and community events. The same clubhouse that once symbolized controlled authority now felt like shared space. Walking home that evening, I passed the president's former house. New owners had moved in. Fresh paint softened the exterior. Children's toys dotted the front yard. The deck no longer held silent surveillance, it held potted plants and wind chimes. The neighborhood looked almost the same. But it wasn't. Structures remained intact: lawns, fences, regulations. Yet beneath them, something essential had changed. Awareness had replaced assumption. Participation had replaced passivity. The barbecue that once drew police lights had illuminated a truth: when authority is used to intimidate rather than serve, it eventually reveals its weakness. And when ordinary people choose to look closer instead of look away, balance can be restored without chaos. The final lesson lingered as steadily as smoke rising into spring air. Power is not dangerous because it exists. It becomes dangerous when it goes unquestioned. That afternoon with flashing lights had felt like an ending. In reality, it had been the beginning of a community remembering that governance belongs to everyone, not just the person holding the gavel.